man nobody bothered to remember the champagne was good. Ethan Wade knew this because he had personally approved the wine list 3 weeks ago, sitting in a corner office on the 42nd floor that his wife had never visited, reviewing a spreadsheet labeled Ardent Group Q or Hospitality Budget, while she was downstairs in the same building, interviewing for the job that would change both their lives. He took another sip and watched her laugh. Claire was radiant tonight. She always was in rooms like this. High ceilings, the kind of lighting that cost more per hour than most people earned in a day. A crowd that checked each other's lapel pins the way other people check the weather. She wore the navy dress he had seen hanging in their closet for 2 weeks, the one she'd bought specifically for tonight, the one she'd turned in front of the mirror and asked, "Does this say I already have the job, or I'm grateful for the job?" He had said, "It says you're the smartest person in any room you walk into." She had smiled at him in the mirror, briefly the way you smile at something pleasant but not particularly useful, and gone back to adjusting the hem. That was 2 weeks ago. Tonight she stood at the center of a loose circle of people who mattered, or believed they did, and she was telling a story. Ethan could not hear it from where he stood, near the bar cart at the far edge of the rooftop venue. But he recognized the rhythm, the slight pause before the punchline, the way her hand lifted, index finger extended, as though drawing the shape of the joke in the air. The moment the circle erupted and she tipped her head back just a fraction, not enough to be unguarded, exactly enough to seem it. He had fallen in love with that laugh 11 years ago in a conference room in Boston, where they were both consultants working for competing firms, and she had dismantled his client's 3-year strategy in 45 minutes, and then laughed at his expression exactly that way. He had thought, "This person is dangerous." He had thought, "I would like to know her for the rest of my life." He still thought both things. A man materialized beside him, mid-50s, silver at the temples, the careful posture of someone who had learned to stand like money rather than simply having it. Ethan recognized him. Gerald Forsyth, board member, one of 4 who had voted unanimously on Claire's appointment 6 weeks ago, without knowing that the majority shareholder reviewing their vote was the man their new CEO described to her friends as "my husband." "He's very stable." Gerald did not recognize Ethan. This was, in Ethan's experience, completely normal. "Friend of Claire's?" Gerald asked in the tone people used when they meant, "And who exactly are you?" "Her husband," Ethan said. Gerald blinked. A recalibration happened behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, but the social arithmetic of deciding how much attention a CEO's spouse warranted. "Ah, of course." He offered his hand. "Gerald Forsyth. I'm on the board." "I know," Ethan said. Gerald waited for more. When more didn't come, he smiled the smile of a man who had written off the conversation and was already planning his exit. "She's remarkable, your wife, truly. We had 47 candidates in that final pool. International search, top-shelf executive recruiters. And Claire was the unanimous choice. Every criterion she exceeded." He paused. "You must be very proud." "Every day," Ethan said. He meant it. Gerald excused himself toward a cluster of people who were louder and more demonstrably important, and Ethan turned back to watch Claire. She had moved, drifted toward the center of the rooftop where the catering staff had arranged tall tables draped in white linen, and she was speaking now with 2 members of her new executive team, her posture open and assured, nodding at something one of them said with the focused attention that had made him choose her for this position long before she ever submitted her application. That was the part no one in this room knew. Ardent Group was a $20 billion holding company with interests across logistics, clean energy, and commercial real estate. It had a chairman, a board, a CFO, a newly appointed CEO, and sitting 2 levels above all of them, in a structure most of the board had never examined closely enough to question, a majority shareholder who had held controlling interest for 9 years under a series of holding entities that routed ultimately to a Delaware LLC called EW Capital. EW Ethan Wade. He had built the structure carefully over years because anonymity was not vanity. It was the only way he had ever trusted anything. His father had spent 20 years accumulating wealth and 12 months losing it to people who had been kind to him only after they knew what he was worth. Ethan had decided at 26 that he would know what he was building before he let anyone else see it, and he had kept that promise to himself with a discipline that had cost him, he was aware, certain things that could not be recovered. He was thinking about this, about cost, about what it meant to protect something so carefully that you forgot to let it breathe, when he heard his name. Not his name, a version of his name, a shape in someone else's sentence. Claire's husband is here somewhere, I think. This was a woman's voice, somewhere to his left, and then a laugh that was not quite a laugh. I haven't met him. She describes him as very supportive. He turned slightly. Two women stood near the entrance to the rooftop stairwell. One of them was a junior executive he didn't recognize, and the other was Diana Marsh. Ethan knew Diana well, the way you know a chess piece you've been watching move across a board for 3 years. Diana was 41, Harvard MBA, and had been Ardent's executive vice president for operations since before Ethan had quietly acquired the company. She was sharp, efficient, and possessed of a certainty about her own importance that had served her well in every room except the one where the actual decisions were made. She had expected to be named CEO. The selection committee, operating under protocols Ethan had designed precisely to remove bias, had ranked her third. Diana had not taken this well. Supportive, the junior executive said, in a tone that treated the word like a polite euphemism. She mentioned him in her acceptance speech last week, Diana said. Did you catch it? She said, and here Diana's voice shifted into something approximating affection, generous and slightly patronizing. To my husband Ethan, who always believed in me, even when I had to remind him what I was capable of. She paused, which is an interesting thing to say at a professional event. But it got a laugh. It had. Ethan had watched the video. He had watched it twice because he was the kind of person who read documents multiple times to make sure he had not missed anything. He had not missed anything. She's really something, the junior executive said, with the sincerity of someone who needed the new CEO to like them. She is, Diana agreed. Her gaze drifted across the rooftop with the particular quality of someone cataloging assets and liabilities. It landed briefly on Ethan. Her expression did not change. He was to her a man holding a glass of champagne he probably didn't appreciate at a party that was slightly beyond his natural habitat. She looked away. Ethan took another sip of the champagne he had personally selected and turned back to Claire. She was laughing again. The circle had grown. 8 people now, the warm gravity of a woman who had arrived. One of the men in the circle said something and gestured at Ethan's general direction, and Claire glanced over, a quick scan, the way you check that a door is still closed. She found him, smiled, the same brief, pleasant smile from the mirror, and turned back to the circle. Ethan set his glass down on the bar cart with care. He thought about what Gerald Forsyth had said. 47 candidates, unanimous choice, every criterion she exceeded, all true. He had read the scoring rubrics himself, sitting in the same corner office on the 42nd floor, the night before the board's final vote. Claire had not known he was 1 floor above her during her final interview. She had not known the structure of the company she was interviewing to lead. She had not known that the evaluation criteria, strategic vision, operational credibility, ethical decision-making under pressure, had been written 9 months earlier by her husband. She had not known any of it. And sitting in that office, reading the committee's assessment of the woman he had married in a small chapel in Vermont 8 years ago, Ethan had felt something that was almost entirely pride and only partly grief, and he had not been able to name the second thing clearly until tonight, standing at the edge of a party he was technically hosting, watching his wife find him with her eyes the way you locate something you've decided not to lose, but also decided not to carry. He knew what the second thing was now. It was the question of whether she would have laughed at him exactly that way if she had known. He thought about the answer for a long moment. He didn't like what he came up with. Across the rooftop, Claire raised her glass toward the skyline and said something that made the whole circle erupt again, and the city glittered behind her, like an audience that had already decided she was worth watching. And Ethan Wade stood very still in the party he owned and thought about cost. What you paid, what you didn't, and what you eventually ran out of. Ethan stayed at the bar cart for another 20 minutes, which was precisely as long as it took for Claire to remember he existed in a social context. She found him with the efficiency she applied to most things. A direct line through the crowd, no meandering, the same energy she used navigating a conference room. Up close, she was slightly flushed from the champagne and the attention, and she was smiling. And for a moment, half a second, the duration of a breath, she looked exactly like the woman he had married. "There you are," she said, as though he had been hiding. "Here I am," he agreed. She tilted her head toward the crowd behind her. "You've been over here the whole time. It's a good corner." Claire looked at the bar cart, then at him, with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to address something or file it away for later. She filed it. "Come meet some people. Gerald Forsyth has been asking about you. He found me earlier. We spoke." Something shifted in her face. Surprise, and then the faint recalibration he had learned to recognize, the one that meant she was updating a file. "Oh, what did you talk about?" "The wine. He thought it was very good." "It is." She touched his arm. A light social touch, the kind that communicated this person is with me to the general vicinity without communicating anything specific to him. "The Whitmore Group's CEO is here. Jonathan Whitmore. It would be worth introducing you." "I know Jonathan." She paused. "You do?" "We've met." This was true in the narrow technical sense that they had sat across from each other in a boardroom in 2019, though Jonathan Whitmore had been introduced to the man across the table as Ethan Cole, an alias Ethan maintained for situations where his legal name might create complications. Briefly, some time ago. Claire studied him for a moment with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual. He was generally good at reading her. "Okay," she said finally. "Come anyway." He followed her back into the crowd and she introduced him to 3 people in 11 minutes, each introduction calibrated with a precision that he doubted she was fully conscious of. "This is my husband, Ethan." Delivered with warmth but no elaboration. In the same register, you might say this is the car or this is the apartment. A thing that existed, was functional, was not the point of the evening. The third person was Diana Marsh. Diana's gaze moved from Claire to Ethan with the efficient assessment of a person who categorized people quickly and rarely revised. She offered her hand. "Diana Marsh, EVP of Operations." "Ethan," he said. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm in the deliberate way of someone who had read that firm handshakes communicated authority. "Claire speaks highly of you," Diana said, in the tone that meant she was extending a courtesy rather than expressing a belief. "Does she?" Ethan said. Claire laughed. Easy, deflecting. "I speak highly of everyone tonight. It's a party." She touched Diana's shoulder. "Diana and I have been working closely for the last 18 months. She's been incredibly helpful in the transition." "I can imagine," Ethan said. He watched Diana's expression, the precise control of it, the way her smile didn't shift when Claire said helpful, even though Ethan suspected Diana would not have chosen that word for herself. He noted it. He filed it in the same place he filed everything that mattered. "What do you do, Ethan?" Diana asked. "Asset management," he said. This was also true. Diana's interest visibly did not increase. "Private clients?" "Mostly." "Interesting." She turned back to Claire with the seamlessness of someone changing a slide. "Claire, I wanted to catch you about the Tuesday agenda." Ethan stepped back, one half step, just enough to exit the conversational circle without anyone needing to acknowledge the exit. He was good at this. 9 years of practice. He found a new corner, slightly closer to the skyline, and stood there with a fresh glass he hadn't asked for. One of the servers had pressed it into his hand with the automated cheerfulness of well-trained hospitality staff, and looked out at the city. Somewhere in this building, 42 floors below, there was a desk with his name on it in a form that no one in this room would recognize. There were files on that desk with 9 years of decisions in them, acquisitions and restructurings and 1,000 choices made in the particular silence of anonymity. The silence that meant the choice was yours, and no one else would get credit or take blame. He had liked that silence for a long time. He was less certain about it tonight, A server passed with a tray of small architectural appetizers. Ethan took one, ate it, and thought about the last time Claire had asked him what he was working on, and actually waited for the answer. He tried to locate the memory with the precision he applied to other things. He found something from 14 months ago, a Sunday morning, early, before her phone started, and he wasn't sure if he was remembering it correctly or if he had simply told the story to himself enough times that it had acquired the texture of fact. Across the rooftop, Claire caught his eye again. This time the smile lasted longer. It looked for a moment almost like the one he had been looking for all evening. He smiled back. The city held its light against the dark the way cities did. Indifferent, enormous, continuing. 9 years of playing small. The first apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Midtown that had a broken elevator from November through February, and a landlord who communicated exclusively through handwritten notes slipped under the door. Claire had moved in with 2 suitcases and a certainty that she would be somewhere better within 18 months. Ethan had helped carry the suitcases up 4 flights of stairs and thought, she has no idea how to be anywhere for long. He had been right, technically. Within 18 months she was better. So was he. They were both somewhere different, though they had traveled there together, which was the part neither of them had entirely planned for. That was the year he married her. 9 years later, on a Thursday morning, 10 days before the rooftop party, Ethan sat at the kitchen island in the apartment on the 31st floor that neither of them had carried anything into. The movers had handled it as they had handled everything after year 3, when better had compounded into something that looked, from the outside, like the life they had intended all along, and read a draft press release. Ardent Group today announced the appointment of Claire M. Whitfield Wade as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Ms. Whitfield Wade brings 14 years of strategic leadership experience across multiple sectors and was selected following an extensive global search process. He read the name, Whitfield Wade. She had hyphenated when they married, which he had loved. He thought about what it meant that her name was now in a press release he had approved, in a role he had designed, at a company he owned, and she did not know any of those last 3 facts. He thought about when the right moment to tell her would have been. He had been thinking about that question for approximately 4 years. The honest version of the timeline was this. He had acquired EW Capital's controlling stake in Ardent Group in the fall of the year they got married, which meant that technically they had been married and he had been the majority shareholder of her future employer at the same time, and that when she came home one evening in year 2 of the marriage and said, "I got the call, they're bringing me in for interviews," he had said, "That's incredible. Tell me everything," while being in possession of information that would have recontextualized the sentence completely. He had told himself he would tell her before the first interview, then before the second, then before the offer. Then when the offer came and she stood in their kitchen with her hand over her mouth and tears, she was clearly deciding whether to cry, he had told himself. Not tonight. Because tonight was hers and the truth would make it his. After that, the timing problem had acquired the quality of a structural issue rather than a choice. The kind of thing that, once left long enough, could not be addressed without demolishing something foundational. So he had not addressed it. He had filed it, the way he filed everything that mattered, and told himself it would become simpler when she knew him well enough that the secrecy itself would not be the headline. He was still waiting for that moment. In the meantime, her career at Ardent had progressed with the trajectory he had predicted, based on criteria he had established, which was another way of saying he had watched his wife succeed exactly as much as he had believed she would, and called it objective evidence rather than what it actually was. The longest, most involuted love letter he had ever written to another person, composed in filings and board minutes and holding structures, addressed to someone who had not yet been given the envelope. The problem with Diana Marsh had begun in earnest 8 months ago. Ethan knew this from Marcus Chen, his chief of staff, who was one of 4 people on Earth who knew Ethan Wade and EW Capital were the same person, and who relayed information from inside Ardent with the concise accuracy of a good intelligence operation. "She's making moves," Marcus had said on a Tuesday in January, in the kind of shorthand they had developed over 6 years of working together. Lateral coalition building. She's got 2 board members in her pocket, Hessler and Park, And she's been having off-calendar dinners with the executive recruiters who ran the CEO search. What does she want? Best case, a seat at the table in selecting who oversees her next. Worst case, she's building a case that the selection process was compromised. Marcus had paused. There's also, and this is softer, harder to document, she's been talking to Claire. Ethan had been still for a moment. What kind of talking? Advisory? Mentorship? Diana's positioning herself as someone who knows where the bodies are buried institutionally, which is useful to a new CEO navigating a culture she didn't grow up in. Another pause. She's also, from what I can tell, shading her picture of the board. And of you. Of me. She doesn't know who you are. But she knows there's a spouse, and she knows the spouse has a lower public profile than she'd expect for someone married to a CEO-track executive. And she's using that the way people use gaps, to fill them with whatever's useful. Ethan had thought about this for some time after Marcus left. What was useful to Diana was a Claire who felt slightly apologetic about Ethan. A Claire who had absorbed the ambient corporate logic that said a CEO's domestic life was either an asset or a liability, and had, with the smooth efficiency she applied to most things, quietly reclassified her husband. He thought about the Sunday morning 14 months ago that he kept returning to. He thought about the mirror in the navy dress. He thought about supportive. He thought about the fact that he had read the interview transcript from the CEO Selection Committee's notes on Claire, where she had been asked, "What does your support system look like?" and had answered, "I've learned to rely on myself primarily. I think that's what got me here." He had read that and felt something complex. He had filed it. 2 weeks before the party, Marcus flagged something new. Diana had begun asking questions. Casual, lateral questions, routed through people who didn't know they were carrying them. About the ownership structure of Arden Group. Not the operating company, but the levels above it, the holding entities. She had gotten as far as EW Capital's registered name. She doesn't have the connection yet, Marcus said. EW Capital is in the Delaware filings, but the UBO documentation is sealed and the routing is clean. She'd need a very motivated lawyer and probably 6 months to untangle it. Or a shortcut, Ethan said. Or a shortcut, Marcus agreed. Ethan had looked out the window of the corner office. 42nd floor, north-facing, a view of the city that he had never described to Claire, because she had never asked what his office looked like, and he had never volunteered that it existed, and thought about timelines. He had been running a calculation for 4 years. The calculation had always returned the same result. Not yet. Too early, too complicated, too much to lose. He ran it again. This time the result was different. Not because he was ready, because the window was closing, and he was beginning to understand that some truths did not wait to be told at a convenient time. They surfaced when the pressure got high enough, and the only choice you had was whether you were the one who surfaced them or whether someone else did it for you, with their own framing, at the worst possible moment. He looked at the calendar. The party was in 2 weeks. He looked at the calendar for a long time. What the glass ceiling is made of the article ran on a Wednesday. Ethan found it the way he found most things about Ardent Group, through a morning briefing that Marcus assembled each day before 7 and delivered to his personal inbox with the subject line Daily Signal. The briefing for that Wednesday was 12 items long. Item 4 was a link to a profile piece in Meridian Business Review, one of the glossier quarterlies that covered executive leadership with the aesthetic seriousness of a fashion magazine covering clothes. The headline was, "The CEO Who Built Her Own Ladder, Claire Whitfield Wade on What Real Leadership Costs." He opened it over his first cup of coffee at the kitchen island before Claire was awake. She was good in the piece. She was always good in profiles. Her answers were specific without being revealing, warm without being soft, confident in the particular way that made people feel included in the confidence rather than diminished by it. The journalist had clearly found her compelling. Most people did. He read through the first half without difficulty. Her early career, the pivots, the strategy work, the years at Ardent before the CEO appointment. All accurate, all the version of events that was true in every detail that Claire knew about. He slowed at a section near the middle, under the subheading, "The Cost of Getting Here." The journalist had asked, "The CEO track at a company like Ardent is a narrow path. What have you had to let go of to stay on it? Claire's answer, as printed: I've had to get comfortable with a certain kind of aloneness. Not loneliness, those aren't the same thing. Aloneness is functional. It means accepting that the decisions at this level are yours, the pressure is yours, and the identity you're building is yours. I learned fairly early that holding on to people or things that weren't growing at the same pace as the version of yourself you need to become, it holds you back. The ceiling isn't always glass. Sometimes it's the weight of things you're carrying that you haven't put down yet. Then 3 paragraphs later, the question: what makes you different from the CEOs who came before you at Ardent? Her answer: I don't carry things that pull me toward the ground. I learned that distinction later than I should have, but I learned it. Ethan set his phone face down on the island. He picked up his coffee. He thought about the ceiling. He thought about weight and what kind of person had to be to put it down, and whether the thing being put down was aware of being carried in the first place. He turned the phone over and read the last line again. I don't carry things that pull me toward the ground. He thought, she doesn't know she said that about me. He thought, or she does. He was not sure which answer was worse. The corner office on the 42nd floor had a peculiarity that Ethan had never corrected. The window did not quite seal at the upper left corner, so on cold or windy days there was a faint draft that moved the papers on the far end of his desk if he left them unweighted. He had worked around this for 3 years with a smooth river stone he'd picked up from a beach in Maine, a beach where he and Claire had spent a weekend in year 2 of the marriage, early enough that everything was still sharp and specific, before anything had softened into habit. He kept the stone on the desk because it worked. He kept it because it was one of the few objects in that office that had come from a part of his life that wasn't exclusively about Ardent Group. He was sitting at that desk, the river stone holding down nothing in particular, when Marcus came in at 11 that Wednesday morning with the expression he used for news that required more than a subject line. She has the thread, Marcus said. Ethan did not ask which she. How far? Far enough. I was meeting with a Reginald Hess, board member, Hessler's cousin, long story, and I mentioned in a context I thought was safe that the ownership level had been watching the transition closely. Marcus sat down across from the desk with the posture of a person who was accountable for something. He mentioned it to someone at the party. I don't know who. By this morning it had reached Diana. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Marcus did not apologize again because he understood that the value of an apology decreased as the problem requiring it increased. What does she have? Ethan asked. She knows a majority shareholder exists, that they were paying close attention to the CEO appointment, and that the person is likely not a passive investor. Marcus paused. She does not yet know who, but she has EW Capital as a name, and I have to assume she's working on the connection. Ethan nodded slowly. He picked up the river stone and turned it in his hand, smooth, gray, cold from the draft. When she finds it, he said, she'll move fast. Yes. She'll take it to the board or she'll take it to Claire directly, depending on which she thinks is more useful. My read is the board, Marcus said. She wants to reconstruct the selection process as compromised. CEO appointment under conflict of interest? It weakens Claire's position regardless of the facts, because the narrative is already powerful even before you examine the evidence. Ethan turned the stone once more and set it down. Set up a board meeting, he said. Closed session in the next 10 days. Marcus looked at him carefully. Are you going to tell Claire first? Ethan was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than silence usually warranted. I'll handle the sequence, he said. Marcus nodded and left without pressing, because pressing was not part of what made him useful. Ethan sat alone in the office with the draft and the stone and the view of a city that continued below him with perfect indifference. He opened his desk drawer and took out a single sheet of paper. Not digital, not filed anywhere. Just paper, the way his father had kept important things. And looked at a list he had written 2 years ago, in a moment of unusual clarity. The list was 8 lines long. The first line read, "Tell Claire before she hears it from someone else." Every other line on the list was contingent on that one. None of the others had been addressed. He folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. He thought about the article. I don't carry things that pull me toward the ground. He thought about Diana, somewhere in this building, with a thread in her hand and the patience of a person who knew how to pull. He thought about Claire reading that interview answer before it went to print, reading it, deciding it was honest, deciding it was worth saying publicly. And he felt the decision he'd been deferring for 4 years arrive at last as something he no longer had the option to file. He opened his laptop and looked at his calendar. The board meeting was 10 days away. That evening, Claire came home at 8:15 carrying 2 grocery bags and the particular energized exhaustion of someone who had won enough small battles during the day to feel, overall, that the day had been won. She set the bags down, poured a glass of water, and told him about a procurement negotiation that had gone well, a VP who had handled a client crisis better than expected, and a dinner with the CFO that had confirmed her read on the company's short-term capital structure. She was good at the debrief. She always had been. It was one of the things he loved about her. The way she could take a complex day and reassemble it clearly. The narrative instinct of someone who understood that the story you told about what happened was almost as important as what happened. He listened. He asked questions at the right places. He made dinner while she talked. Pasta, from memory, the way she had taught him in year 1 of the marriage before she stopped having time to cook. At some point, she noticed the food on the table and looked at him with an expression that was almost puzzled, as though she had briefly forgotten he was the kind of person who cooked dinner. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. She sat down. She picked up her fork. She looked at the food with what he read, carefully, as something like gratitude. And then her phone buzzed and she picked it up, and her attention moved the way water moves completely and without remainder, and she was gone again. He ate his dinner and watched the city through the window and thought about 10 days. The name on the door. The closed board session was scheduled for a Thursday at 2 in the afternoon in Conference Room A on the 40th floor, a room Ethan knew well, having approved its renovation in 2021, which was another piece of information he had never shared with the people who now use the room. He arrived 11 minutes early, which was later than he usually arrived for things that mattered, and earlier than any of the board members had expected him to be there at all. The room held 9 people when full. Today there were 8, Gerald Forsyth, the 4 other standing board members, Diana Marsh, Marcus, and Ethan. Claire had not been told about the meeting. This was the part Ethan had run through most carefully, the part he liked least about the sequence he had chosen, and the part he had been unable to find an alternative to that didn't involve Diana controlling the narrative before he had the chance to establish the facts. Diana arrived at 1:58, saw Ethan sitting at the far end of the table, and paused, less than a second, just enough to register, before taking her seat. Gerald Forsyth looked from Diana to Ethan with the expression of a man who had arrived to a meeting with a different agenda than the one apparently happening. "Thank you all for being here," Ethan said. "I requested this session. I'll be brief, and then I'll give the floor to Ms. Marsh if she'd like it." Diana's chin lifted slightly. She had not expected to be acknowledged this way, as someone with a prepared case rather than someone being summoned. He watched her recalibrate. "My name is Ethan Wade," he said. "I'm the beneficial owner of EW Capital, which holds a controlling stake, 63% of Ardent Group's parent structure. I have been the majority shareholder of this company for 9 years." The silence in the room was the specific silence of people who had just been asked to revise a very large assumption very quickly. Gerald Forsyth set down his pen. Ethan opened the folder in front of him and distributed a document to each seat. Marcus had prepared 7 copies, bound in gray cardstock, the kind of preparation that communicated seriousness rather than hostility. "This is the foundational documentation," Ethan said. "Ownership structure, acquisition history, shareholder agreements, and, relevant to the specific question I expect Ms. Marsh has been preparing, the full record of the CEO selection process, including the original criteria document, the selection committee's mandate, the blind review protocols, and the scoring records for all 47 candidates." He let them begin reading. He waited because he was good at waiting, and because the document said most of what needed to be said. After 2 minutes, Gerald looked up. "You're the—" He stopped. restarted. You and Claire Whitfield Wade are married, yes. Ethan's voice was even. 8 years. We met before I acquired the controlling stake in Ardent. Claire joined the company as a senior director 4 years into our marriage, through a standard recruitment process. She has never held an ownership interest, has never had access to information about EW Capital's position in the company, and to my knowledge has never suspected that the majority shareholder structure reached back to our household. Diana spoke for the first time. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not rage, Ethan thought, but the sound of a very specific plan meeting a very specific obstacle. You're telling us you are the controlling shareholder of this company, you are married to our new CEO, and that the board was never informed of this. The board was never required to be informed under the ownership structure as constituted, Ethan said. That structure is legal, properly documented, and has operated transparently at the regulatory level. What I'm doing today is choosing to make it known to you, rather than waiting for an alternative version of this information to reach you through a different channel. He paused. I'm aware that Ms. Marsh has been investigating the ownership structure. I'm choosing to address her questions directly, rather than through intermediaries. Diana did not look away from him. And the CEO appointment? The criteria for the CEO search were established by me, in writing, 8 months before Claire applied. He indicated the document in front of them. The criteria document is dated and witnessed. The selection committee operated without knowledge of my identity. The blind review protocols ensured that committee members did not know my relationship to any candidate. Claire was ranked first out of 47 by 5 independent evaluators who had no information about her personal life. The appointment was their unanimous recommendation, which I then approved as the majority shareholder. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Gerald Forsyth was still reading. His face had the quality of a man doing careful arithmetic. 2 of the other board members were doing what people do when they are absorbing information that has no comfortable home in their existing understanding. They were very still, in the focused way, not the vacant way. Diana said, "This is a conflict of interest." "It could be characterized that way," Ethan said. "It could also be characterized as the majority shareholder of a company evaluating a candidate against documented, independently reviewed criteria and reaching the same conclusion as every other evaluator who reviewed the same evidence. The characterization you choose will depend on which facts you prioritize." He looked at her with the attention he gave to things he had decided to look at carefully. "Ms. Marsh, I know you expected the CEO appointment. I know the committee's decision was a disappointment. I want to be direct with you. The criteria that ranked you third were not written with you in mind. They were written in 2023 before the search was announced by me, without knowledge of who would apply. You can examine the dates and the signatures in those documents." Diana's expression did not shift, but something in the room shifted, very slightly, in the way things shift when a very particular kind of argument meets a very particular kind of evidence. "Why are you doing this now?" Gerald asked. He asked it without accusation, the question of a person who wanted to understand the sequence. Ethan considered the question. He owed Gerald an honest answer. "Because the alternative was letting someone else frame it," he said, "and because I've been planning to do it for longer than I should have." He paused. "And because I read an article this morning that made me understand that the window for choosing how this conversation happened was closing." He did not elaborate on the article. Gerald nodded slowly, in the way of someone who did not require the elaboration. Ethan gathered his copy of the documents, aligned the edges on the table, and closed the folder. "I'll make myself available to answer any questions from legal counsel. I'm also prepared to discuss a governance resolution that addresses my ownership position going forward, if the board determines that's warranted." He pushed back his chair. "I'd also ask that someone inform Claire, not immediately, but today. She should hear this from the company, not from a news alert." He stood. Diana looked at him, not the way she had looked at him at the party, not the glance across a room at a man she had already dismissed. She looked at him with the specific attention of someone revising a category entirely. He saw something move across her face that was not quite humility and not quite anger, and was perhaps, underneath both of those, the beginning of understanding that she had been playing a game in which she had not correctly identified all the pieces. "Mr. Wade," she said. He looked at her. "Does she know?" Diana's voice was quieter. The quality of the question was different from the others. Not a board question, not a legal question, a human one. Ethan was still for a moment. "No," he said. "She doesn't." He left the folder on the table and walked out of conference room A and into the elevator without speaking to anyone else in the room. He pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator descended. He watched the floor numbers drop. He thought about Claire standing in their kitchen 9 years ago with her hand over her mouth. He thought about the trial balance of 9 years of careful decisions and what they added up to, and whether any arithmetic could make the sum look like something she would recognize as love rather than what it was also. Silence, and the long habit of it, and the particular damage that accrues when protection becomes a form of distance so gradual that neither person remembers when the gap opened. He thought, she deserved to hear this from me. He thought, I am out of time to be the person who should have told her. The lobby doors opened. He walked through them into the cold light of the afternoon and stood on the pavement of a city that didn't know him and had no opinion about what he had just done. His phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. "She's in the building," they told her. Ethan put the phone in his pocket. He kept walking. Everything she earned, everything he kept. The lobby of Arden Group's headquarters building had a particular quality in the late afternoon. The light came through the west-facing glass at an angle that made the marble floor look almost warm, almost like something other than stone. Claire stood in it on a Thursday at 3:47 in the afternoon and did not feel warm. She felt like a person who had been handed a file that rewrote the last 8 years of her life and had been asked to continue the rest of her day, as though the file were a minor administrative update. Gerald Forsyth had been kind. He had used the word extraordinary 4 times in 12 minutes, and she had understood that he was trying to tell her something that didn't have a clean word yet. That the revelation was complicated in a way that didn't reduce neatly to either good news or bad news, that the ground under her position was still solid, that the documents were clear and the process had been clean, and that what had just happened in conference room A was both a disclosure and a disruption, and the board was still deciding which of those it was, primarily. She had listened. She had asked 3 precise questions about legal exposure and governance procedure, because those were the questions she knew how to ask. She had not asked the question that was actually moving through her, the one without a professional category, the one that went 9 years. She called Ethan's cell phone in the lobby. It rang 5 times and went to voicemail. She called it again. Same result. She called Marcus, who picked up on the second ring and said, in the careful voice of someone navigating a situation that was not quite his to navigate, that Ethan had left the building approximately 45 minutes ago and had not given a destination. She thanked Marcus and stood in the lobby light and thought about 45 minutes, about where a person went after disclosing something they had kept for 9 years, about where Ethan would go. She knew where he would go. Diana Marsh retained legal counsel by 4:15 that same afternoon. The lawyer was a partner at Creighton & Associates, a firm that specialized in corporate governance disputes with the particular enthusiasm of people who understood that conflict of interest was a phrase that could mean many things, and that meaning in these situations was largely a function of narrative momentum. The lawyer's name was Victor Hale, and he filed a formal complaint with Arden's governance committee by 5 p.m. arguing that the CEO appointment process had been materially compromised by the undisclosed ownership interest of the appointing shareholder, that Claire Whitfield Wade's position was therefore legally contestable, and requesting an emergency board review. Ethan was notified at 5:14 via a text from Marcus that contained exactly 1 sentence. She filed. He was sitting in a parking garage in Midtown when he read it, in a car he had rented under his own name for the first time in years, because the alternative was calling a driver who would be traceable, and he had wanted for an afternoon to be unfindable. He had driven around for a while. He had stopped. He had been sitting in the parked car for 20 minutes thinking about what came next. He read Marcus's text. He called his own attorney, Rachel Gow, who had been his legal counsel for 11 years, and who answered the phone with the focused calm of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by the timelines of other people's decisions. "I need you to prepare a full disclosure package for an emergency board session," he said. "All ownership documentation, all selection committee records, all blind review protocols, everything, including the original criteria brief from June 2023 with the independent timestamp." "I have most of it already," Rachel said. "Marcus sent me the outline 2 hours ago." "Good. Ethan." She paused. "Victor Hale is good at this. The conflict of interest narrative is going to have momentum regardless of the documents, because the story is more compelling than the paperwork. You need to be in the room." "I know. And Claire needs to be in the room." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that too. Do you want me to reach out to her directly?" "No," he said. "I'll handle that." He sat in the car for another few minutes after the call ended. The garage was dim and smelled like concrete and old exhaust. Outside, the city made its usual sounds. Traffic, a distant siren, the incomprehensible collective noise of 12 million people organizing themselves around their own purposes. He thought about Claire in the lobby, getting the call from Gerald. He thought about her face doing the math. 9 years. And then the question that followed the math, which was not "why didn't you tell me," but something harder. Did I know you at all? And if not, what was I doing for 9 years? He thought about the rooftop. My husband, he's very stable. He thought about the kitchen and the pasta and her phone buzzing and the way attention moved, completely like water. He thought about Maine and the beach and the river stone on his desk. He got out of the car. The emergency board session was held the following Monday morning at 9 a.m. Victor Hale was precise, well-prepared, and genuinely skilled. He presented Diana's complaint in 3 parts: the existence of the undisclosed ownership relationship, the potential for the selection criteria to have been designed with a specific candidate in mind, and the appearance of impropriety regardless of intent. He used the phrase structural integrity of the appointment process 7 times. He was good at the language of reasonable doubt. Rachel Gow let him finish. Then she put the June 2023 criteria brief on the table, dated, independently timestamped by a third-party legal firm. She put the blind review scoring sheets on the table with the 5 evaluators' names and credentials. She put the methodology document on the table with the outside governance consultant's signature at the bottom, a consultant Diana herself had recommended the previous year for a different project, which Rachel noted without emphasis but with impeccable timing. Then Ethan spoke. He spoke for 11 minutes without notes, because the facts were ones he had assembled carefully enough over 9 years that they did not require notes. He explained the criteria. He explained the process. He explained that the criteria had been designed to identify the best available leader for Ardent Group based on what the company needed, and that when the selection committee's unanimous result came back, it was the same result he had privately predicted 18 months earlier, based on 14 years of watching one particular person do the work. He did not say "my wife." He said "the candidate," the way the documents said it, because the documents were the argument and the argument was real. At the end of the 11 minutes, he said, "I'm aware that this situation is irregular. I am not arguing that it is simple. I am arguing that it is clean, that the appointment process produced the correct result by an independent standard, and that dismantling it would harm the company and would constitute an injustice to a person whose qualifications have been verified by 5 independent evaluators who had no knowledge of her personal life." He sat down. Victor Hale tried to reframe. Rachel addressed each frame. The board asked questions, good questions, the kind that probed rather than performed, and received answers that were documented, consistent, and reproducible. Diana sat across the table from Ethan throughout this. She did not speak during the board's questioning. At one point, midway through Rachel's response to a particularly complex procedural question, Diana's eyes moved to the June 2023 document in front of her, to the timestamp, to the independent seal, to the 5 evaluators' signatures, and something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically, quietly, the way things shift when you have been certain of something and the evidence removes the certainty one layer at a time. After 2 hours, the board voted. The appointment was upheld, 6-0. Gerald abstained on grounds of procedural caution, but even his abstention was accompanied by a statement that the process appeared to have satisfied the relevant standards upon review. Diana's complaint was dismissed. The board additionally voted, 5-1 with Gerald dissenting, to open a governance review of Diana's conduct in pursuing the complaint through external legal channels without first exhausting internal channels, a violation of Arden's own executive dispute protocols. Diana did not speak when the vote was announced. She gathered her materials with the precision of a person who understood that the room had a memory and that how you left it mattered. Victor Hale spoke to her quietly in the hallway. Ethan did not hear what he said. 3 days later, Diana Marsh submitted her resignation as Executive Vice President of Operations. She cited personal reasons. She was gone from the building by the end of the week, with a settlement that was fair and a non-disparagement agreement that was mutual. Her office was cleared by the facilities team on a Friday afternoon, and by Monday the nameplate was gone, and the hallway had no memory of her either. Claire came to his office building 3 times in the 11 days after the board session. The first time, she came to the lobby on a Tuesday and asked the front desk for Ethan Wade. They called upstairs. He asked them to tell her he was in a meeting and would be in touch. He was not in a meeting. The second time, she came on a Thursday with coffee. 2 cups from the place on the corner of 54th, where they had gone on Saturday mornings in year 1. She waited in the lobby for 40 minutes. He watched the security feed from his office, not from cruelty, though he understood it could look like that, but from the same impulse that had always driven him to observe before engaging, to know what he was walking into before he walked into it. She sat with both cups of coffee in her hands, and eventually the coffee got cold, and she left, and he sat alone in his office in the silence he had built with such care, and thought about what it meant that the silence no longer felt like protection. The third time, she sent a message instead of coming in person. It said, "I'd like to talk, not about the company, about us. I think I owe you some things, and I'd like the chance to say them." He did not reply to that one either. He filed it. Out of habit or fear, or the same mechanism that had produced 9 years of careful, expensive silence, he couldn't distinguish between them clearly anymore, which was itself information. On the 12th day, he went to the apartment building on 57th Street, where they had lived for 5 years. Not their current apartment, the one before, the one they had left when Better had compounded again, and the next building had been larger and quieter and had an elevator that always worked. The building on 57th, where he had, quietly, retained a lease on a storage unit because some things were easier to keep than to decide what to do with. He was moving boxes. He had been moving boxes slowly for 3 days. Not everything, just the things that were clearly his. The distinction being harder than it seemed when you had spent 8 years accumulating a life with another person and had not kept good records of what you brought to it. He heard the door to the storage unit hallway open. He turned. Claire stood in the doorway. She was wearing the kind of clothes she wore when she wasn't working. Not the CEO version, not the party version. Just clothes, jeans, and a sweater he recognized. Dark blue, the one she'd had since before they were married. She looked like herself in a way she sometimes didn't look like herself in the room she had been occupying lately. She looked, he thought, tired. "Marcus told me," she said. "I'm sorry. I know you didn't want me to find you." He turned back to the box he'd been sorting. "I didn't tell Marcus where I was. He figured it out." A pause. "He's been with you for 6 years. He knows what you do when things get hard." Ethan did not respond to this. He folded the flap of a box and moved it to the side. "I read everything," Claire said. "All the documents, the criteria brief, the evaluator reports, the board minutes, everything Rachel filed." She paused. "I read the June 2023 brief 3 times. "Okay," he said. "You wrote it before I applied." "Yes. The criteria, strategic vision, operational credibility, ethical decision-making under pressure. You wrote those before I was a candidate." "Yes." Silence. "Ethan." Her voice changed. Not the CEO voice, not the party voice. Something older from further back. "When did I start doing it?" He looked up. The thing I do, she said. Where I... She stopped. Started again. At the party, I made a joke about you. In front of the board, in front of people who apparently work for you, though I didn't know that at the time. She pressed her mouth together. I've been trying to remember when I started treating you like that, like something adjacent to my life instead of... She stopped again. He waited. I don't know when, she said. And that's the part that I can't let myself not say out loud, because if I don't say it, I'll find a way to explain it, and explaining it will mean not actually looking at it, and I've been not looking at things for a while now. He set down the book in his hand. Diana told me something, Claire said. About 4 months ago. She said the board viewed our marriage as a liability, that they'd promoted me slowly because of you. That you were... She stopped. I knew it wasn't true. I knew it at the time, but I let it change how I stood next to you in rooms. She looked at him with the directness she used when she had decided not to perform. That's on me, not on Diana. On me. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I should have told you, he said, about EW Capital, about Arden. He said it flatly without cushioning. I had reasons. Some of them were even good ones. But I let them accumulate until they became a wall, and I should have told you before you ever interviewed for that job. Why didn't you? He thought about the question. He gave it the space it deserved. Because I wanted to know if you'd stay, he said, if you knew what I was. And then it became... He shook his head slightly. I convinced myself I was protecting something. I think I was afraid of what the answer would look like. Claire was still for a moment. I would have stayed, she said. Then, I think I would have stayed. I don't actually know, and that's... She exhaled. That's part of what I'm sitting with. That you didn't trust me with the truth, and I can be angry about that. And I also know I gave you reasons not to. The storage hallway was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the building made the sounds old buildings make. Settling, breathing, existing in the way of things that have stood through many versions of the people inside them. The party, Ethan said. What you said. I need you to know that it... He stopped. Started again, because he was precise about most things and he wanted to be precise about this. It wasn't the joke. It was the way you looked for me and found me and looked away. Claire's expression did something complicated that moved through several things quickly before settling on one he hadn't seen in a while. The one from the beginning, the one without calculation in it. I know, she said. I know that's what it was. He looked at her across the boxes. She looked back. I'm not asking you to... She started. I know, he said. A pause. The apartment on 53rd, she said. We haven't been back to that building since we moved. I know. The elevator's still broken in winter. I don't know. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile and was not quite grief and occupied the specific territory between them that had always been theirs. The place where she was sharpest and most like herself, and where he had, for 11 years, always known exactly how to stand. I don't want to explain my way around what I did, she said. I want to actually reckon with it. I don't know what that looks like from your side. Neither do I, he said, which was true and which was also the most honest thing he had said to her in 4 years. She nodded. She did not try to make it easier than it was. Can I help with the boxes? She said. He considered this for a moment. Yes, he said. She stepped into the storage room. They worked in silence for a while, side by side, sorting through the accumulated material of years. The things that were clearly one person's. The things that were clearly both. The things that had no obvious category and had to be decided in the moment without reference to any previous system. Some things take years to break and minutes to name. The damage Ethan and Claire had done to each other was not dramatic. There had been no single rupture, no scene, no door slammed hard enough to leave a mark in the plaster. There had been only the slow accumulation of small choices, a truth deferred, a look filed away, a person edited down to a function they performed in someone else's story. The ordinary violence of two people who loved each other, choosing, again and again, the version of honesty that was most convenient. What Ethan had learned, sorting boxes in a storage room with a woman who was still, in the most fundamental sense, the most capable person he had ever known, was that strength is not what you protect. Strength is what you risk. You can build a structure that holds everything you've made and call it safety, but if the person standing inside it has never been shown the blueprints, you haven't built a home. You've built something that looks like one, from a distance, at the right time of day. And Claire had learned, or was beginning to, which is the only way anyone learns anything that costs them, that the ceiling you're most afraid of is sometimes the one you've installed yourself. That putting down the things that pull you toward the ground is not always the same as becoming lighter. Sometimes the weight you're dropping is a person. Sometimes you don't notice until they've been on the ground long enough to have learned to stay there. They were not repaired. They were not the same. They were two people who had looked at each other honestly for possibly the first time in years and had found underneath the distance, in the silence, in the 9-year gap in the record, something that was still worth the difficulty of the reckoning. That was enough to start with. That was, in fact, everything.